All right, quick commentary on the commentators. So these are, I'm going to be looking at people who are maybe fringe commentators, not the mainstream, but they're definitely right about a lot of things. I will criticize them when I think they're wrong or have missed something, and there will be definitely things that they know or have studied that I haven't. So these two guys, Max Blumenthal and Aaron Matty from the Grey Zone, always pretty interesting to watch. I'm just going to click on the video and see parts of it and see if there's anything that inspires me to say anything about it. The reason I'm doing this is because I feel like, well, I'm 62 years old and I feel like I have seen through a lot of the BS that was later recognized as BS over decades. And I think, I don't know anybody who has done it, who has seen through every major topic, right? Now there's some minor, less major topics that maybe I didn't know anything about, I didn't pay attention to, but the big ones, you know. So I'll give an obvious example is WMDs in Iraq, saw through that in a nanosecond, the whole thing. I won't go into the details of what I saw and why I saw it and why I knew it was BS. But you get through other things, all sorts of other things from the 2008 crash. There was a lot of BS around that. I saw through that immediately. And 2014 Scottish independence referendum. I'm from Scotland. I live in Vermont, USA. Brexit referendum. Saw through that. BS. Russiagate, was a load of BS. That Russia was controlling everything. They even said that here in Vermont that Russia, Rachel Maddow or someone, reports that Russia has hacked a power grid in Vermont. No, it wasn't. It was just a glitch in the system or something. You get up into COVID-19, there's a lot of BS talked about that. That was that's when the hysteria really kicked in, and this hypnotism really started. Mass formation hypnosis, it's being called. And there's a guy who talks about that, Matthias Desmet. I think he's from Holland. So it's quite interesting, and he's right, and it seems obvious to anybody as well when you start hearing him explain it. It's like, yeah, that's exactly how it goes. But this mass hysteria has now turned into a form of hypnotism, which is how hypnosis works. You focus the attention on something, especially if it's something scary. You're going to weaken the mind, and then you program the mind to think the way you want it to. So it's propaganda and also brainwashing. And so that happened in 2020 and 2021. And now those people, those mainstream people who are a lot of them are leeching out the system now because they're actually boomers. And it's time for them to retire. They're moving on. The world's just not something that they can understand. But a lot of the ones who are, maybe you might call them millennials or late Gen Xers or something, they're still the mainstream commentators, politicians, etc. News people, whatever. Even in the intelligence agencies, I kind of think there's a lot of fluff and old school thinking going on, and in general old school thinking, right? So not to say that all boomers are clueless, but they're pretty clueless, a lot of them, right? So I consider myself Gen X because I grew up in the punk rock era, which was sort of a revolution in the UK. Punk rock, the new mods, what else was there? All sorts of other things going on. And there was a band called Generation X when I was a young teenager, or a teenager. And it was called that for a reason. So it represents their generation. So that's, so anyway, so there might be some late Gen Xers in the news media and such like, and famous sort of news anchors and such like. Everything you're seeing this old school thinking. I'm not saying that the new understanding of the world is any better. It might be worse in some ways, millennials and Zoomers, that kind of thing. But in overall, we're seeing these people who went through all that, what was essentially a type of brainwashing through hysteria, mass hysteria, and herd mentality, right through, definitely through Russiagate. There was a lot of hysteria, right? And once you get that hysteria and fear maximized, then you definitely are in a situation where the brain is pliable. These are just facts. And then COVID 2020 and 2021 became a mass hysteria, a mass self-hypnosis maybe. I'm not saying it's some nefarious group. A lot of people taking advantage of it, both here in America and around the world. But certainly, at the very least, the self-hypnosis in which they're now stuck. And they're sort of turning into zombies. They can't even see what's right in front of them. So this is my commentary, pre-commentary to try to set this up and tell you a little bit about me. And let's just see. So there's so much going on. I've talked a lot about these topics, including Ukraine. And I'm just going to start commenting a little bit on little snippets of what others are saying, most of whom I admire their work in a lot of aspects of their work, and will critique them when it seems that they're a little bit off on something, or completely wrong even. So yeah, definitely do that. So let's see what this is.
So Aaron, you interviewed this Ukrainian government whistleblower, Andrei Telesenko. I'd actually seen him briefly quoted in an incredible documentary series by a French filmmaker called whose website is called Le Creuset, LES-CRISES, I think .fr, and it's about Biden and the general prosecutor of Ukraine and the corruption around Burisma. And then Garland Nixon featured him, and then you had him for, I thought, the ultimate interview, really drawing everything he knew out about Maidan, which he apparently was heavily involved in, all the way up to the Ukraine proxy war. So who is Andrei Telesenko, and why is he so significant?
He is a former Ukrainian official who worked in Ukraine's government before the 2014 Maidan coup and afterward. And he witnessed what he says was basically a huge U.S. role, not only in the coup, but also in the post-coup government, to the point where the U.S. was deciding who could be hired and who couldn't inside Ukraine. And he's very critical of the Bidens. He's very critical of Zelensky for running on a peace mandate that he personally himself believed in. But then he says Zelensky basically sold out under pressure from the West, including especially the US and UK. And he made a lot of really important claims in our interview. Let's just go to one. So here he is talking to me about what he witnessed, what he says.
Right, so I've actually seen this clip, and you can watch it on your own rather than watching the whole thing. But so to sum that up as maybe the most important, well, not the most important, but certainly sort of symbolic of that whole era, which I have looked into a little bit, you get to things that are, I think a lot of people know, is when, just as a symbolic of what Aaron Matty is talking about here, and the person he interviewed, symbolic of that, I'm not saying it's the most important point, but there's a lot more subtlety to all this, but symbolic of that is Joe Biden, when he was secretary, vice president, sort of threatening the Ukrainians that he was in Ukraine, I believe, at the time. He claims he was, and he's the one that said all this, said that he'd said this. He claimed that he threatened them. Didn't use those words, I'm paraphrasing, of course. They said, well, you won't get the $1 billion if you don't, fire some general prosecutor or something, right?
I said, no, I'm not going to, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority, you're not the president. The president said, I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
So you guys probably know about that, but It's symbolic of the whole thing of Americans just pressurizing the government of Ukraine over more than a decade. It goes back to 2014, where a lot of people are saying that America interfered, 2013, 14, and that's where a lot of these problems and disputes with Russia came from. And then you get Russia saying, well, this is, we don't like the way things are going. So they take over Crimea, I think it was around 2014, and not much happens with that. But then there's a lot goes on. Zelensky eventually gets elected, which he seems like the darling of the West. You know, at the time, I suppose if I'd listened to him, I thought, oh, this could be good. Maybe he'll be like a bridge between, you know, a progressive or an intelligent bridge between Russia and Europe or something. But it became pretty clear looking back on it that he moved pretty quickly to being a puppet, whether by his own devices or not. But I think he got threatened by people in his own somewhat nationalistic government and others in the military, that if he negotiated with Russia over anything like Crimea or the Donbass, they would eliminate him, right? They didn't use the word kill him, but it'd be a bit scary when these pretty much, I think they're like ex-generals who still have a lot of sway over some military units. And at that time, anyway, people deny it, but at that time, the Azov battalion was definitely had some, I'll call it fascist influence. And by fascist, I mean white supremacist. It's nothing to do with anti-Jewish or whatever. It's white supremacy or you know, Slavic supremacy, Caucasian, the Caucasus, all of that. Those people who want their own Slavic region in parts of Russia, Poland, Belarus, Moldova, probably, and of course Ukraine. So there's a movement like that going on for years, even decades, and they might claim they're not Nazis, even though a lot of them have swastikas tattooed on them. And others will do a lot of Nazi salutes. And they might claim that they're not. But they certainly go in that direction, even if ultimately maybe they're not. I don't know. There's a football, I'll put a clip to that. There's a soccer match, and it's Ukrainians doing this Nazi salute in the crowd. Yeah, it looks like a Nazi salute. So, and maybe they'll say, "Oh no, it's not. It's something else." Well, maybe it is, but it's definitely this. It definitely has the very, very strong overtones of a authoritarian fascism, right? And it's just a soccer match, but you see that throughout the recent history of Ukraine, and many of the mainstream media reporting on it. So if you're the president in 2019 or 2020, President Zelensky, and you've been this fun-loving guy who made his way through and suddenly find yourself president because of being an actor who acted being president. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up, right? It's just incredible. I mean, Hollywood made this up. They must have done, right? So it looks like he did get threatened by some pretty serious gangsters in Ukraine, that if he negotiates with Russia over anything, the Donbass, any of that, they'll eliminate him. And then on the other side, you have America, who doesn't want him to negotiate with Russia over anything. They want to control Ukraine and whatever America's intentions were, it certainly comes across as highly interventionist in a foreign country, a democracy, which, surprise, surprise, they've been doing for many, many decades. And so, should we think that now we're in the pure era? We've got past all that bad stuff that America did when they overthrew the leader of Iran and caused an endless stream of problems in the Middle East that caused a lot of what the CIA and others call blowback. When you interfere so much, you get blowback, and then the CIA supposedly spent a lot of their time trying to manage all the blowback, and one of the blowback from disrupting the Middle East again and again and again by intervening there was 9/11. That was blowback. And also at the Afghanistan war. All of it, just destabilizing the place, thinking you're clever, and causing more mess than was there in the first place. So it's a complex topic, but ultimately now you're doing it in Ukraine. And Zelensky has now gotten to the point where he will be a dictator. The West has abandoned Zelensky. I said this last year. They abandoned him basically. Yeah, they still sent him weapons, but they weren't really getting involved. And I think for a long time, Ukrainians and Zelensky thought the West would come in with boots on the ground and their own tanks and their own people and their own aircraft and their own, super weapons, whatever, their own navy off the coast, whatever it took. They thought that. Because, I'm sorry to say it, but Ukrainians are sort of naive. They were behind the Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union for a very long time and not really in a prominent position there. So it wasn't like being in East Germany or something where there's a lot at stake, or in Moscow itself where there's a lot at stake, the Kremlin. So they're sort of in between, but it was sort of nowhere land, really. No offense to Ukraine, Kiev, ancient and wonderful history, wonderful people. But I think they end up being sort of having the wool pulled over their eyes about what the world was really like for decades. And now the new generation, which came out of that, still really hasn't caught up. It takes a generation to start to figure out how the world really works. And I think you also, along with that, you did have quite a lot of maybe self-aggrandizement. In other words, look at our history, look at us, aren't we so special in the middle of this East and Western world for centuries and centuries, and we know how the world works, and also we're Slav, Ukraine, and all that. So there's a lot of other naivety that's gone on, and and because of that, as soon as first of all, in the very beginning of the war, you had a lot of people in Ukraine who think they're sophisticated players trying to do basically what are PR operations and propaganda. And that's we now know that a lot of it was just people in Ukraine telling the West what's going on and just lies, right? So the woman who was an official in the Ukrainian government, a minister, was fired for telling lies to everybody that Russians were raping women and children. This is way back in the beginning, right? She got fired for spreading that with no proof, right? So it was a lie, but it's not the only one, because I think even after that, or before and after that, there was a lot of desperation, and these sort of PR people who are so naive about how the world works, you could see through it. Well, apparently most people could not see through it. They just believed the nonsense they were being told by these very amateurish sort of propagandists in Ukraine. And so, you've heard it all. Shall I go, what else did they do? I don't know. Some real obvious ones. Oh, the Russians hit Poland with missiles. No, wait, no. And that one everyone saw through, right? No, you did that. you accidentally did it or tried to do a false flag with the missiles that hit Poland, right? Ukraine did that. So nobody got fooled by that, but there were a lot of other lies that people did get fooled by. I won't go over them. I don't have time. It's endless. Endless propaganda that everybody and their dog in the world just took up as if it's gospel truth. Russia was never trying to take over the whole Ukraine, topple the government, and put everyone at gunpoint. They were after those eastern provinces, and that's all I'm going to say on that, because if I go down that line, it's a whole nother video. You can maybe see some of my other videos on that. But that's what they were doing. They were trying to take the eastern provinces. So if anybody had a different thing in their mind, whether that's a politician, a commentator, Sean Penn, who went there and gave his Oscar to another actor, bizarre. Who else? There's a couple of other famous actors being stupid. But whatever was in their mind that Russia was trying to take the whole of Ukraine, once you have that in your mind, which is wrong, they never were, then everything else around it is coloured, and your brain is not assessing things accurately, and therefore your brain is not really doing a good job, and the lies that you're told are just absorbed and repeated again and again on social media and the mainstream media, right? So, again, I won't go through the list, because if I go down that road, it's a long story, but there are so many lies that were told, and the West just believed every single one of them. And they were not on the ground. They were not these great news reporters on the ground from the BBC or New York Times or anywhere who were on the ground there seeing exactly what's going on. No, they weren't. Everybody just believed whatever they were told, and there was too many. And Ukraine got desperate and told more and more lies, and Russia got what they wanted, which is the eastern provinces, and they've held them, and they'll continue to hold them. These are just the facts. So, in terms of what Aaron Matty's talking about here, and this interview that he had with a Ukrainian, it's this interference with from the West and America especially with Ukraine over a decade or more, and it ends up in this situation where you have this darling of the West, Zelensky, the new Churchill, whose country has been ruined. It's just too sad to even laugh about, but it is sort of cartoonish, him being this actor and everything, and Russia going after the eastern provinces, and that's all they were doing. But now he's considered the darling of the West, and the Churchill, who is now being abandoned after putting in depleted uranium missile warheads from Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister of UK, and then Biden and the Americans desperately putting in cluster bombs right at the end there. We'll be back, cluster bombs, ha. Well, that's an admission that you've lost the war. It's finally sinking into Zelensky, into him, that the West is not going to help him. It's over. They're trying to distract to other things now. Watch out, West Africa, because the West, and America especially, needs to divert their attention away from Ukraine now at all costs, because there's an election coming up in just over a year. So, sorry, I hope that doesn't happen to West Africa. I don't know what else they're going to do to distract. They'll have another attempt to make COVID hysteria this winter, quite possibly, but don't think it'll work. And then, of course, Trump being indicted is a great distraction, but that won't be enough to distract from the whole what they need to do in the election, which is make themselves look good. Either side, this duopoly, which is the Republicans and the Democrats, the establishment. So they'll find something, or they'll try something, and it won't be Ukraine. They'll try to divert your attention away from Ukraine at all costs, because it's a disaster. Zelensky will become a dictator, and if he doesn't, he'll get pushed out, hopefully non-violently, but I hate to say it. Hopefully not. And then another dictator will come in who will sidle up to Russia more than the West, because the West has abandoned them. Ukrainians will never be the same again. if they did trust people like Lindsey Graham, who went over there, John McCain saying, we've got your back, we'll be there, it's time to push back against Russia.
Your fight is our fight.
Ваша боротьба – це наша боротьба.
2017 will be the year of offense.
Рік 2017 рік буде ріком нападу.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемося до Вашингтону і ми будемо відстоювати санкції проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
Час вже щоб вони заплатили важчу ціну.
I believe you will win. I am convinced you will win, and we will do everything we can to provide you with what you need to win.
And all these young soldiers standing there going, I don't know what was going on in their minds. They probably know Americans are kind of full of shit sometimes, but at the same time, they probably thought, oh, they're with us and they'll be there for us. Now, those young Ukrainian men and women, especially men, I think, over there, are just being pushed into this grinding machine in eastern Ukraine and just dying en masse, or hiding, or trying to leave the country, bribing people to leave the country. And who can blame them? Because that is a disaster of epic proportions, what the West has foisted on Ukraine by, first of all, interfering in their politics and then not following up when they said they would. But, you know, Russia having to intervene because they felt the region next to their border was very volatile. And a lot of Russian speakers there, ethnic Russians. And also there were votes in those Donbass regions, in those eastern provinces that had voted for semi-autonomous, to be semi-autonomous. So from Russia's point of view, it's not that much different than the UK going into Northern Ireland in 1969, when Northern Ireland voted to be part of the UK, but a lot of people in Northern Ireland, or at least the active ones, thought it should be part of Ireland, not the UK. So the British Army went in there, and then it ends up being what people end up calling it the Troubles. So these troubles that were going on in Northern Ireland for decades, they're called the Troubles. And that's kind of what Putin was looking at in the eastern provinces, where, according to the West, Russia shot a missile from the eastern provinces of Ukraine and hit a passenger plane. I forget the name of that plane, you might remember it. So they got blamed for that, but it wasn't the Russians. It was just some renegade people in that region. So obviously the region was volatile, and all sorts of gangsters and mafia and, gangsters going through the ports there on Odessa, the most corrupt port in wider Europe, maybe the world. People trafficking, drug running, illegal arms running, the lot. Right, so through Odessa and other Black Sea ports. So it was really bad. Maybe Russia can make it a bit better. I think they can. So that's the way I look at it, is their rationale for doing it. From their point of view, having that volatility on their border was not suitable for them. And so they went in and decided they'd just sort it out, because the West wouldn't do it. Right, so that Europe and the US wouldn't do it. If anything, they made it worse. So the Minsk Accord was an agreement. The Minsk Accords were an agreement between Russia and the West and Ukraine, and they just kept getting broken, these agreements. And finally, Russia just decided, well, they just keep breaking this agreement, so we're just going to have to protect at least the border regions, because we can't have that on our own borders. And also a lot of those people would rather be in Russia, probably. It looks like they would. So in those eastern provinces, so they're certainly going to get stability at this point, because Ukraine is going to fall apart. Well, if it doesn't fall apart, it'll be an extremist dictator who will sidle up more to Putin or to Russia than to Europe. And so he'll move towards Russia, he or she, dictator. So, but more likely it's going to be a bit of chaos. And, I don't even want to think about it. I don't see how Ukraine moves ahead. Yeah, so that's just a quick commentary on what Aaron was talking about there. And I'll go over more of that later. But in the meantime, this is where we're at. Whereas Zelensky has been abandoned. His only choice now is to become a sort of a dictator, which it looks like he is doing. And if he does, and he will have to be pretty hardcore, and he might get a lot of support as long as he doesn't negotiate with Russia, in which case someone else will take over. And I think over time they will start to move towards Russia, because the West, Russia's the strong man in the region now. The West has been beaten. NATO has lost that war. There's no way out. So there's a lot more detail to that, but that's enough for right now. Okay, thanks.